In this lecture, we'll be taking a look at the specialized discipline of geomorphology, an important scientific study that looks at landscapes and landforms, their evolution, their change over time. We'll also be taking a look at the many disciplines that contribute to the work of geomorphologists. And as your author points out in the opening chapter of the course text, the geomorphologist, in a sense, provides individuals with a deeper understanding of how a landscape began and how it will ultimately change. Geomorphologists will, in a sense, take a look at internal structure and the mechanisms within that internal structure and how those are contributing to the evolution of a landscape. So let's start out with some of the basics. We'll start out with a definition. Geomorphology, in a sense, is the science of land surface development and change. It encompasses a study of the processes that change the surface of the planet, both terrestrial and submarine. So again, the science of land surface development and change. Now, when we take a look at how this specialized field behaves, we have to make sure to emphasize the central role that things like physics and chemistry play in how we understand a landscape and its change over time. Geomorphologists will be interested in what is referred to as planetary geosystems. Now, a planetary geosystem, in a sense, relates to processes that incorporate flows of energy in our solar system. Geomorphologists will study expressions of energy across the surface of the planet. They'll take a look at how energy moves through the planet itself, and they will compare and contrast these expressions of energy and its effect on matter throughout space and how our planet behaves within the solar system itself, more often than not referring to what is called the Sun-Earth relationship. Geomorphologists will not ignore matter. They will incorporate materials, minerals, and elements as they compare and contrast how those particular minerals and elements and the larger landscapes they're a part of, how those interact with different expressions of energy, things like heat or light, things like magnetism, or the behavior of specific chemical compounds within things like soils. And they will examine this material and energy relationship in terms of how it behaves on a systematic level. They will attempt to understand what aspects of systems theory can be applied to a landscape and how materials in that landscape and energy expressed around and within that landscape are behaving. So when a geomorphologist looks at a landscape, he or she is looking at organic and inorganic material and how it behaves within that landscape, generally in a systematic way. He or she will, in a sense, embrace the idea that an order exists within nature and that it will behave in a fairly predictable manner. Now, this isn't always the case. We do realize that nature can sometimes behave in a very chaotic fashion. A good example of this predictive and unpredictive nature with regard to natural materials and their interaction with energy can be found in two 20th century concepts, what we may call discoveries. The first would be Fritz Zwicky's observation of dark matter, which he documented in the early 1930s. One of the first observations of dark matter is attributed to Zwicky's work. In 1933, he was studying the motions of faraway galaxies. One of his initial areas of study was to estimate the mass of these observed galaxies, and he did so by measuring brightness. After testing out a variety of computational methods to verify his work, he realized that there may, and in a sense there was, other forces at work. That the mass associated with the movement of these galaxies was much larger than what he was able to estimate from brightness. In this case, it was something that was unseen, and he referred to it as dark matter and dark energy. In the opening decades of the new millennium, British researchers from a wide variety of fields tested Zwicky's work, and they came to realize that dark matter was a reality and that it did have an important role in the movement of celestial bodies. Not only were they able to estimate the overall mass of galaxies that were visible or observable, but they were also able to estimate the speed at which celestial bodies were in motion and even estimate the temperature of stars similar to our sun in these swirling galaxies. Zwicky's observations and those additional aspects of study that have verified his work have taught us a lot about the nature of energy and matter, and that the line that divides these two sometimes mathematical constructs is very gray, that there sometimes is no division between the nature of energy and the nature of matter that acts in relation to that expression of energy. We can turn our attention to two other important names that you have probably been exposed to in your studies. The first of Albert Einstein, but also a more ancient name, in this case Pythagoras. Pythagoras, and then quite a bit later, Albert Einstein, are generally linked to the idea of small building blocks that are associated with matter. In this case, the smallest of building blocks, or electrons. Einstein, near the end of his life, and looking at many of his computations and many of his notes, began to realize that there may be something even beyond the level of electron. In this case, waves of energy that are building blocks of matter that are even smaller than what we were able to perceive. And these very small expressions of matter and or energy can be likened to the generation of a musical note on a stringed instrument. The tension that exists within the string of a stringed instrument is very much a part of the expression of sound and the action of the energy that's being applied to that to produce the sound. Well, string theory, in a sense, is a theory of quantum gravity. And like the energy that is excited along the string of an instrument, along this stretched, tightened string, and how that string behaves in terms of changing in shape and expression as it interacts with and expresses its own energy, this is something that has been applied to our understanding of what gravity is and how it behaves in the natural environment. Through our understanding of string theory, we have come to realize that particles themselves, these very tiny, unobservable aspects of matter, transmit their own force. So string theory, in a sense, has closed the gap or narrowed the gap, if completely wiping out the gap between energy and matter. We have come to realize now that matter, at its most base expression, in its smallest theoretical sense, does emit a particular expression of energy. Now, of course, these ideas are very challenging to apply to a slope that is in constant change as water from a nearby storm begins to saturate local soils. It is near to impossible to apply some of these ideas to the effect that changes in elevation may have on the flow of a stream or a river. However, what this does tell us is that when we look at a natural landscape, we can understand that landscape mathematically. And when we look at it, even in its most chaotic, systematic expression, things such as a mudslide, we see these expressed in coastal portions of California when we have not only forest fires, but then we have a forest fire season being then followed up by a rather rainy season. When we look at these very chaotic and often very destructive kinds of events, we can understand them in a very predictable manner. And using a wide variety of scientific disciplines, we can build upon what in the 1960s and 1970s became known as quantitative geomorphology. The idea that numerical data can be gathered concerning landforms and the processes which are at work within them. We can then look at this in a mathematical manner and be able to understand something about where that landscape is headed, physically, or how it may be changing over time. So the geomorphologist has to wear many hats when he or she is studying and analyzing a landscape. We do know that, however, a geomorphologist, his work will fit really into two major camps. First and foremost, a geomorphologist will be a physical geographer. He or she will be very familiar with places, place names, locations, the distribution of landscapes, the expressions of continental landforms, marine landforms. And then second of all, a geomorphologist will also be a geologist, interested in the physical makeup of a landscape and the energy that is involved in transforming that landscape over time. So to be able to accomplish the scientific study of geomorphology, we have to be multidisciplinary. And this has been the case ever since really the 4th century BC. Geomorphologists will ally themselves with a variety of disciplines, including the work of geophysics or geophysicists. These are individuals that are looking at mechanisms that are at work within a landscape and the rates of particular kinds of landscape changing forces such as uplift. They will ally themselves with geochemists. Geochemistry really focuses on the rates and nature of chemical reactions during things like rock weathering. Climatology becomes very important in the study of a landscape. Climatologists will add things such as the effect that climate has on geomorphic processes, either speeding up particular kinds of processes within a landscape or slowing them down. Pedologists are also important to the work of geomorphologists. A pedologist, and we'll take a closer look at this in later lectures, will look at soil properties and their relationship to physical qualities of a landscape, such as slope, and ultimately they will tie these ideas into understanding things like stability within a landscape. Geomorphologists will ally themselves also with anthropologists. Anthropology, by nature, is the study of human technologies, their impact on human biology, and how human biology connects to not only the nature of the planet, but also the lower atmosphere. And of course, we can't leave out biology. Biologists contribute significantly to the work of geomorphologists. Biology provides us with an understanding of the role that vegetation has on the chemistry of the Earth's atmosphere, its lithosphere, the variety of expressions of planetary moisture, and of course processes such as erosion. So let's step back for a moment and look through a historical lens. And let's ask ourselves how this need to comprehensively or holistically understand landform structure and change, how this emerged. Now, although the term geomorphology actually emerges in the 1880s in papers that are being presented across Europe, the ideas and the specializations within geomorphology have very ancient connections. In fact, it takes us all the way back to the Greek and the Greco-Roman period. Our story starts in the 5th and 4th centuries BC. Herodotus was not only a great historian, but he situated all historical events within geographic and landscape contexts. Aristotle is also an important name to associate with this opening chapter of the history of geomorphology. Aristotle pioneered new ideas regarding solar energy and the geometry associated with our planet. He also gave us the idea that landscapes will change and develop over time, and that this can be understood mathematically. As we move forward in time, approaching AD, we at 30 BC recognize the work of the Greek philosopher Strabo, who reinforced the idea of regionalism in landform structure and regionalism in terms of how that structure changes. He also took a very geographical point of view when he mapped out these unique patterns. In the opening decades of the Christian era, we recognize the work of Lucius Seneca. This was, again, a Christian era statesman and philosopher in terms of his work. However, he also contributed to the Classic Age and later the Renaissance, and how we, at that time, understood patterns of weather and ultimately climate change. If we fast forward quite a bit and move our perspective to the 15th century, AD, of course, we look at the work of Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci, other than being not only a wonderful artist, a anatomist per se, maybe amateur anatomist, of course, a philosopher as well, he also dabbled in geomorphology, studying fluvial geomorphology in an attempt to understand the predictability of stream actions as they interact with one another in drainage basins or within stream or river valleys and the ecosystems that we associate with those geographic regions. His focus was looking at stream action and the process of erosion. Of course, Da Vinci was a master of many trades. Geomorphology was definitely one of them. He also studied the role that earthquakes played in the deformation of landscapes and in the development eventually of what becomes igneous outcroppings or igneous intrusions in landscapes that are exposed after erosion occurs. And again, he looked at these through a geographical lens, so he mapped this material out. However, when you're looking at the development of geomorphology as a discipline, the kind that we instruct, that we work in today, you have to turn your attention to the 19th century. The 19th century really becomes the true birthplace of the landform science, or landform sciences in general. So let's take a closer look at some of the ideas and some of the names that are associated with this burgeoning discipline. One of the first names to associate with the 19th century discipline actually appears in the late 18th century. And this is the work of an instructor and a researcher by the of James Hutton. In 1785, Hutton presents probably one of the most important documents that connect geomorphology with not only geology, but connect geomorphology with the scientific public at that time. In 1785, he was presenting this paper to the Royal Society of Edinburgh, in which he argued that the land surface and the land surfaces that we see, that we observe, that we measure, that these have been shaped by slow, erosive actions, generally actions that will in some way, shape, or form incorporate water. The other thing that Hutton does in his paper is he also connects these landscapes with major catastrophic events. And he believes that, again, taking and looking more closely at the history of a landscape allows us to understand how these processes are constantly at work. The excerpt of a paper of Hutton's that I have for you here to look more closely at dates from 1802. A colleague of Hutton's, John Playfair, a professor of mathematics at the University of Edinburgh, presented this information and described Hutton's work. at that time. In this study, in this paper entitled Illustrations of the Huttonian Theory of the Earth, Playfair writes, "Every river appears to consist of a main trunk fed by a variety of branches, each running in a valley proportioned to its size." So there he's acknowledging some sort of proportionality to a drainage basin. He continues, "And all of them together form a system of valleys, communicating with one another and having such a nice adjustment of their declivities that none of them join the principal valley, either on too high or too low of a level." Here he's looking at the flow of water, in this case surface runoff, as having some sort of quality both in a kind of an X and a Y format. The idea that there is a change in elevation that's part of this quality of the flow of water. And then, of course, there is a length to the flow as well, and there are sections to that flow. So in this paper, Playfair is identifying Hutton's perspective. He is verifying that there are proportional mathematical qualities to the flow of a stream, to the flow of a river, to the flow of any water particles across the surface of the planet, and that these systems of flow are interconnected with one another, and like he points out, they seem to almost communicate with one another on a mathematical level. In a sense, Huttonian theory then represents the first step toward extending present-day observations regarding the geological history of the planet. It provides, in this case, geologists, physical geographers, with some sort of predictable pattern that can be calibrated at a particular scale as it relates to time. Well, if we fast forward a bit and move into the 1830s, we recognize the work of another very important geologist in this case, but definitely somebody that is an integral part to the development of this specialization that we recognize as geomorphology. This is the work of Charles Lyell and his idea of uniformity. As you may or may not know, Lyell became important to the history of landform genesis and change in the 1830s when he published his very important work, The Principles of Geology, which is still in print today. From this work comes the geological and geomorphological principle of uniformitarianism. Let's take a closer look at a brief excerpt from this work. Lyell writes, "Geology is the science which investigates the successive changes that have taken place in the organic and inorganic kingdoms of nature. It inquires in the causes of these changes and the influence which they have exerted in modifying the surface and the external structure of our planet." If you're to take a look at his definition for geology, we're really looking at a definition that drives our current study. We are a science. We're interested in change, of course, how a landscape initially forms and then changes, and then how organic and inorganic orders interact with one another within that landscape. And again, energy is driving this interaction. Then the final piece here is the idea of modification. He is identifying, in a sense, that these processes are exerting some sort of force. And we'll take a look at how force is being measured in a variety of ways, both within our readings and then, of course, in our lecture material as well. But he's looking at how force, in a sense, is constantly and actively modifying the surface of the planet. Now, one thing that he is not acknowledging in this section of his thesis is that these same processes are occurring internally. And next week we'll be taking a look at some of those internal processes a little more closely. But again, he has that perspective. He has that vision for what eventually becomes geomorphology. There is a lot to be discovered with regard to Lyell's publications and his research. But a lot of this can be boiled down into what have been referred to as his principles, and we'll kind of look at these more closely at this time. Basically, the principles that Lyell laid out in his publications fall into four major camps, and we'll go over each one here. The first kind of principle that I'd like you to get into your notes is this idea of the uniformity of law. This is the assumption that natural processes are constant, both in time and space. So the assumption that natural processes are constant in both time and space. His second principle builds on that somewhat. This is the principle of the uniformity of process, the idea that past events can be explained as the consequence of the modern age. So what we see today, in a sense, can explain the past. The processes that are at work today in our natural landscapes can be things, and again, this would have to be in an unmodified landscape, but these are things that can be used to understand the past and records, geological records of the past. So the second one, the idea that past events can be explained as a consequence of the modern age. A third principle, the university of rate, also referred to as gradualism. This is the idea that changes on the Earth's surface are slow, steady, and predictable. So again, the uniformity of rate, also known as gradualism, the idea that changes on the Earth's surface are slow, steady, and predictable. And then fourth and finally, and these aren't really in any particular order, it's the uniformity of state. The idea that the physical and chemical nature of the modern Earth is identical throughout its entire history. So the idea here, this uniformity of state, that the physical and chemical nature of the modern Earth is identical throughout its entire history. Now, as you can imagine, these ideas and much of Lyell's writings were challenged both by his colleagues, those living at the time that he was publishing, but also generations of geologists, pedologists, and geomorphologists, geophysicists who followed. However, he is, in a sense, establishing a foundation of thought that's very important to our current study. One of the greatest challenges actually came soon after his initial publications in the 1830s, and this was the idea of catastrophism. So starting in the mid-1830s, a number of geologists embraced the idea of catastrophism. They took a look at drift deposits, such as those that were associated with the work of glaciers or the process of flooding, and they used these deposits that they could observe firsthand in terms of their formation to, in a sense, push back on a lot of the principles that Lyell had established. Many of the challenges to Lyell's principles and to much of his writing and many of his observations actually, in a sense, drove the discipline forward and established a wide variety of additional studies and resources. Glaciation became a really important topic during the 19th century. In 1840, Louis Agassiz, a French glaciologist, identified and characterized the Great Ice Age. He published a great deal on his observations, but his Les Études sur le glaciaire, published in 1840, really represents a culmination of all of his work. In this publication, and of course others, Agassiz described the landscapes of northern Britain, the United States, and Switzerland to be wholly the result of glacial action and glacial work. The idea that the landscapes that you may live in today, according to Agassiz, were, in a sense, glacial landscapes, post-glacial and periglacial landscapes. And in the 1840s, this was a very radical, very new idea. Then by the 1870s, Agassiz had expanded his discussion of glacial geomorphology to be very similar to what we had with Lyell regarding the flow of large segments of ice. And so he was connecting stream action, even what we saw with Hutton's work, with the principles of Lyell and the landscapes that he was seeing in predominantly northern portions of our environment, the northern hemisphere in a sense. And so he started to study in the kind of late 19th century flow and stream action as it related to the work of glaciers, and then of course as glaciers ablated or receded, glacial outwash as the meltwater began to run to lower elevations. He studied all of this and looked for mathematical principles, predictable qualities to, in this case, the flow of water and material transport. At about the same time that Agassiz and others are studying the work of alpine glaciers in Europe, there were a number of North American geologists, archaeologists, physical geographers that start to contribute to this developing discipline. And so we'll highlight a few of these real quickly in your notes. John Wesley Powell, best known for his work at the Smithsonian and at a site known as the Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, Ohio, he applied a number of geomorphological concepts to his understanding of how archaeological sites survive during and after their occupations. He began to document the relationship that existed between local bedrock and its formation with things like soil development, landform genesis, and then of course landform change. He developed some structural and would almost appear to be genetic classification schemes for things like mountains and systems of drainage. And he coined the term base level, which is still used today by geomorphologists, especially those that study stream morphology. Base level, in a sense, relates to the dynamic change that we see in landscapes over time and how that dynamic change connects to things like elevation. Base level, in a sense, is the elevation, the physical elevation above mean sea level, toward which all land and all particles within a land surface are eroding to or moving toward. So base level, again, just to repeat myself here, is the elevation, the physical distance above mean sea level, toward which all particles within the landscape are eroding or moving. So in a sense, this base level concept represents a physical point in terms of what drives energy, because those particles, very often transported by water, want to get to that elevation. It also represents a physical point below which stream erosion ends. Grove Carl Gilbert is another very important name, a North American contributor to this developing school. He created the first systematic analysis of mutual interactions between things like erosion and the hardness of rock material. So he contributes significantly to the work of John Wesley Powell and, of course, soil scientists who follow. So again, he creates the first systematic analysis of the mutual interaction between erosion and rock hardness. And he did this, he created a series of laws for dynamic landscape development. He also gives us the idea of systematically a dynamic equilibrium, this idea of a particular kind of instability, systematic instability that exists within a land environment that appears to contribute to the overall evolution of that land. So again, he's giving us a series of laws for landscape development, and then he also coins the phrase dynamic equilibrium. Finally, there's William Morris Davis. William Morris Davis is recognized, and we've kind of reached the end of our historical journey here. He is recognized as the founder of American geomorphology. He was a Harvard-trained geologist, and in the 1870s, he was a professor of physical geography at Harvard. He applies the idea of a system of geomorphological change, all within larger evolutionary frameworks. So Davis is very important for this notion of evolving landscapes. And much of his writing, when you look back at it, will deal with soil environments, and he'll look at cycles of erosion as it relates to the development of particular kinds of soil horizons and soil deposits. So combining these two ideas, Davis is giving us the notion of an evolving landscape, and a landscape that as it evolves can be understood in a mathematical nature. And then he also connects these ideas cyclically to the concept of erosion and soil formation. So his idea of cycles of erosion as it relates to soil formation become also very, very important. It should also be mentioned that Davis's work and the work of his graduate students paved the way for a British and American partnership in what has become global geomorphology. So another thing that can be attributed to Davis, and this really goes back to the idea of holistic and multidisciplinary approaches in this discipline, is that he was very much akin to the development of partnerships within academic circles. As we move into the 20th and 21st centuries, really it kind of boils down to two names with regard to the development and continued development of the discipline. Many of the principles that we'll be looking at, we'll be reading about, really can be tied to the work of, in this case, Robert Horton and A.E. Stoller. What Horton and Stoller give us is the notion of quantitative analysis as it applies to the discipline. Their work can be understood as a type of geomorphometry, or morphometry, as it is also identified, but geomorphometry or morphometry, which again is a kind of a primary means by which we analyze landscapes today. In your readings and in portions of our lecture series, we will be applying morphometry as it relates to stream conditions and stream flow. Robert Horton's work in the mid-1940s really becomes integral to stream analysis and this idea of how landscapes, some of which we're building upon today, are in a constant state of flux. So I'm going to give you some of this information. We'll start out with what morphometry is, and then we'll move into some of the principles, even the laws, that Horton's work and, again, Stoller's contributions are present here as well, how Horton and Stoller's work contribute to some of these concepts. Let's start out with morphometry. So morphometry, in a sense, is defined as the measurement of shape. Morphometric studies in the field of things like hydrology, first initiated by Horton and Stoller in the 1940s, really are applying mathematical principles to how natural processes work and generally the lay of the land. Hydrologists acting or utilizing on the principle of morphometry will generally look at things like elevation. They will look at flow, or the speed of how water particles are flowing across the surface, the shape of flow, how something is channelized, or whether or not it is meandering in a sense, what the load is of that flow, and then ultimately the process of deposition. So how at particular points in the flow or near the end of the flow, as energy is dissipated throughout the system, how the particles that are being in a sense carried aloft through a flowage are being deposited in different ways. Much of what Horton and Stoller studied in the 1940s and the 1950s has become part of what is known as a holistic batch of stream properties or processes. And it is the expression of these over time and throughout space that many geomorphologists today will focus on. And when you take a look at your readings, you'll see how, in this case, holistic stream properties and processes find their way into a wide variety of landform analyses. Let me briefly break down some of these concepts in a variety of ways. We'll start out with what is referred to as the drainage basin prediction model. And Robert Horton's work is very much of a contributor to this model of analysis. Basically, how this breaks down is he's looking at a stream in a very systematic way. He is dividing a stream into channel segments, and he is ordering these numerically. He's, for example, taking the headwaters of a stream and he is separating them out by order with what we see in the flow, the center flow of a basin environment, and even some of the smaller tributaries that are contributing to the flow. Now, his numerical ordering system begins with tributaries at the stream's headwaters, and generally he will assign the lowest value to these expressions, both vertically and horizontally. He'll assign the value of 1 to the smallest flows within the watershed. A stream segment that results from 2 or more of these first order segments will then be given the next value, which is 2. So as we start to see these tributaries with a value of 1 at much higher elevations generally within a drainage basin, as they begin to coalesce and contribute to developing stream environments, these streams, which generally will cover a little longer space in terms of their overall linear measurement, these will be given a value of 2. Now, as these particular stream segments begin to coalesce into larger flowages, and again, they're being measured not only in a linear fashion, but we're starting to see quite a bit of variety in terms of the overall width of the flow. They are given higher values. So the 2s will flow into a third category or a third order, and so forth. Now, what's interesting about this is Horton in particular recognized that as these orders of flow begin to coalesce with one another, there are some measurement qualities, these observations that he's making, that begin to overlap, and he refers to this overlap as his bifurcation ratio. Now, we'll look at this more closely later on, but let me describe it to you for just a moment. If you take the various orders of flow, 1, 2, 3, 4, within a drainage basin, and you count the number of flowages that fit into those categories, you look at the number of 1s there are, you look at the number of 2s, the number of 3s, the number of 4s, and you start to create ratios between them, you start to see a pattern, and it's generally a rule of 3. If, for example, you take all of the first order flows in number and you divide them by all of the second order flows, generally you will result, or you will have numerically a number that is 3.33333 and so on and so forth. What that taught or told Horton, in a sense, is that there are proportionalities to the drainage basin and the various segments of that drainage basin. And you have this almost predictable ratio of bifurcation. And he understood this, again, by taking a look at the number of flows within each stream order. Another important contribution that Horton made, and it really builds off of some of the predictability that he's seeing in a drainage basin, has been collectively recognized as his stream laws, or his fluvial laws. And one of these fluvial laws is this law of stream numbers, which really the bifurcation ratio is informing, in a sense. Well, again, let's take a very brief look at this, and we'll come back to this later, but let's take a look at these laws that Horton and Stoller are establishing, as are others in the developing field of fluvial geomorphology. First, as I said, is that law of stream numbers. The law of stream numbers, in a sense, is looking at the ratios that exist between stream orders, and that there is generally a 3 or 3 plus approximate expression to these ratios as we move from the tributaries, which feed into a drainage basin, and slowly move to, let's say, the mouth of a river. Another law that is very important to the work of these two researchers is the law of stream length. The concept in this case that there are geometrical relationships between streams of a given order, that if we take a look at stream order 1, very high up in elevation, and we measure the linear length, and it does meander, but we'll talk a little more about how we measure a meandering stream as we move through the course material. But as we take a look at the length of that flowage, that generally all other stream orders that have that same order approximation, in this case 1, have generally the same length. Finally, we have the law of drainage basins, the idea that drainage areas assigned to a specific stream order will be nearly identical. So the physical space, the actual space horizontally and vertically that is being drained by a surface stream, or is contributing in a sense to the water particles within that surface stream, that is generally the same. So the physical space, the geographical space that is being drained by a order 1 or an order 2 or order 3 or order 4 within this drainage system, all of these spaces generally will be identical. So again, when we take a look at stream action, fluvial geomorphology, something that is applied to a wide variety of fields and is very much of a foundational specialization within the discipline of geomorphology, we start to really see the culmination of this very lengthy history that takes us all the way back to the 5th century BC. It's this idea of creating predictive models for the landscapes that we study, classify, categorize, and organize. And again, I think it is the work of geomorphologists who would be also called hydrologists that really typify the culmination of this very lengthy history. An example, just a final example to share with you of this, this application of mathematical relationships within a natural setting would be the idea of drainage density. So a measure of drainage density is also a ratio in this case. Quite a few decades of research have taught us that the drainage density of a region is a ratio of the average stream length and the basin area that is being drained by orders, stream orders within that basin environment. So when geomorphologists are assessing things like environmental hazards, very often they will identify a drainage density for an area. It really provides, in a sense, a model of how water is flowing through a landscape, how that model is changing over time, or if there is an imbalance within that landscape. And as that landscape attempts to, in a sense, reestablish equilibrium, these become helpful resources in being able to predict major flooding events or major kind of mass wasting events, such as landslides. And these models then can help us to establish further models of understanding how streams over time will separate out in terms of their flow or coalesce in terms of their flow, and how changes in weather patterns and ultimately climate change as it relates to precipitation patterns will over time affect how a landscape develops and changes. And so these predictive models, as I kind of said before, really represent a kind of a culmination of all of the work of physical geographers and geologists over time who are interested in understanding the interplay between energy and matter within our local landscapes.